So that's how they proved me as a lineal direct descendant of Sitting Bull.
You're listening to The Cultured Bumpkin, a literature podcast with Jake Phillips, where we present audiobook quality readings of the classics for your enjoyment. Thank you for stopping by. And remember, just because you're a bumpkin doesn't mean you can't be cultured. A while back, I visited the battlefield of the Little Bighorn. That's where Custer of the 7th Cavalry was defeated. And I'm a Army guy. I was in a cavalry unit, so that kind of thing really fascinates me, as well as the history of the West, of the American West. And it's just fascinating with all its horror and, majesty. There's so many interesting things, good and bad, about the West and the people that lived and died in it. And I picked up a book while I was there at the gift shop called Sitting Bull, His Life and Legacy by Ernie LaPointe, his great-great-grandson. Sitting Bull's great-grandson. And it is magnificent. It's very personal. I mean, it really does feel like someone is talking about their grandfather, not some guy from history that they don't know anything about and just read a lot of books on. Like, it's very interesting, and it goes into a lot of the culture, the language, the history of all kinds of things in the Lakota culture, not just, warfare and the Battle of Little Bighorn and stuff like that. It has all kind of things in it, and the viewpoints and stuff. One of my favorite lines in it was, it mentions that the Lakota word for child or children is something sacred grows. I think that's really cool. It's not like, oh, there's loud little brats over there, just shut up. It's they really look upon children as they're little creations that are in the process of blossoming into something wonderful. You know what I mean? And I really like that. And the book is chock full of things like that you're just not going to get from most other type of history books. So I highly encourage you to buy the book. I'll have a link in the show notes. But I am excited to share this interview with you with Mr. LaPointe, and just really appreciate him taking the time to talk with me and share about the language, the culture, and all that kind of stuff about his not only his great grandfather but his people. And I had a wonderful time, and I hope that you have as much fun listening to him talk as I did, because he is a magnificent communicator, and I really think you're going to enjoy this. So I was, I'm a big fan of your book. I picked it up when I was at the Little Bighorn, my first trip, and it was one of my favorite books that I've ever read about your great-grandfather, just because of the family aspect. But I was wondering if you could kind of introduce yourself personally, and then we can get into your family history a little bit.
Okay, my name is Ernie LaPointe, and I am the great-grandson of Sitting Bull. And how I'm related to him is from my mother's side. My mother was the granddaughter of Sitting Bull. And, I've been knowing this all my life, who my relatives are. Our Lakota culture that teaches to share with us to learn who our ancestors are and have a lot of respect for them. And, I guess you might say I was kind of intrigued at the beginning when I was a little child. I was told all these stories about who my ancestor was. And I really didn't know him I didn't know he was kind of a famous person or anything, that he was just my ancestor, to me. It's my grandfather. That's what my mother always told me. So this is how I came into existence as, for the first many years, I never told anyone that my great-grandfather was Sitting Bull. And, I served 6 years, almost 6 years in the military. I never never told anybody I was, ever related to Sitting Bull or my first two ex-wives. I never said anything about it because this was the respect that I was told to have towards my grandfather. You don't brag or you don't, boast about your relationships, about your ancestors. So that's what I did, and for many years, my mother told me at the beginning, she said, there'll be a time in the future when you can tell this. And it's like, I have to have permission from somebody older than I am to do this. But my mother passed away when I was 10 years old. So I didn't know if I was ever going to do this. Well, then I had an aunt who is my on my mother's side. One of my great grandmothers is relative. Her name was Gray Eagle. And she came out and she told me in 1992, she just basically told me, she raised her voice loud. She said, it's time for you to come out of the closet, out of the shadows, and tell this world that, they're direct descendants of your ancestors still living and they're on this earth. And you need to tell the stories that your mother told you. So that's when I came out of the closet. You might say out of the shadows, out of the corner, the darkness area. And she gave me opened the door for me so I can do what I'm doing. And basically our stories are oral, in the Lakota language. So it basically stays within your conscious and your mind. If you have a native language, you can't veer off or add into anything the language. It's not like this language we're speaking to each other. You have a forgetful time after 50 years or whatever, and you have a tendency to not really recall dates or names or anything. In the Lakota language, it's solid. It sticks to your. It's like glue in your head. So I used to, when I started doing this, when I told these stories about my grandfather, people didn't really know, because this language we're speaking to each other is not the Lakota language, and at the end of the talk, I might ask for questions and people would ask questions about something I had just said a few minutes earlier, And so one day I was invited to the University of Michigan to give a talk to some anthropologists. So I was there and there was this college professor from Toledo University who was in the audience. And after I got through, she came up and asked me if I could come and speak at her university. And I said, why not? So I could do that. So it was just, a little ways from Ann Arbor to where she was at. So I came down there and she told me, and I spoke to her class, and there weren't that many of them in there, but they had a hard time trying to, they were like a sponge, but, they really couldn't keep what I was saying in their mind, because I started to realize then, that something's not right with this, this language I'm telling them these things about, because it stays in my head. But if you spoke Lakota, if I told you these things, then, you will know what I just said and it would stay with you. So she told me, she says, why don't you, write a book? And I said, this is oral stories. You don't write books, it's supposed to stay with you. Well, at the beginning, I didn't really realize, the difficulties I was going to have doing this. So I kind of said, okay, I'll take it into consideration. So I came home and I went to a ceremony, with the spiritual leaders. And I said, I can't make I don't know what to do, with this question. And they said, well, they understood this from the spirit world. They said that, it's this language, they call this a backwards dead language that we're speaking to each other. That's why you can't retain, a sentence or something. If I tell you something and then 10 minutes later, if I ask you what did they say at the beginning, I realize that people don't know what I just said at the beginning. So they said, they understood what it is. So they said, yeah, they give me permission to write this. As close to the way the oral stories in Lakota was shared to me, to do this in this language. So I sat down and I did that book. There's so much more, but it was just certain points, in my grandfather's life that I put in the book. But there's so many other stories, that I could have put in there, but I figured, well, I don't want to. I just want to highlight who his life is, and not eventually, I don't know. It's just kind of hard to explain. In Lakota, you know what I'm saying, but in English, it's in American English, it's really hard to put his life in context of what in Lakota is. So I wrote the book the way it is, and since then, I've had people who bought the book and write to me, email me, and told me they read the book 3-4 times, and each time they read the book, they got something that they missed, and so I understood what the spirit told me about this, language, the two different ways, and they also told me that in this language I cannot really hit the point of what I'm saying, because in this language, you have too many meanings. The English, American English, is made up of many different nationalities, many different languages combined to make it up. So it's very difficult to try to hit the point. And I used to, at the beginning when I was doing talks, my wife is in the back room. She's always going like this because, I'm trying to make a point, and it's really hard. I'm basically almost repeating myself and trying to because you can never hit that point of in the story what I'm trying to make. So, it's kind of I guess it's a real chore for me, because I kind of feel, I guess you might say, sad or sorry, but that this, most people who don't know no other language except this backwards language, so makes it difficult for those of us who try to talk about these stories of our ancestors or our culture.
Yes, sir. Well, I know I certainly enjoyed it and learned a lot. And I read a lot about the American West and stuff, but this was, the first time it felt much more personal than any book that I ever read about, your great grandfather or Lakota people or anything. But for those that are not really familiar with your great grandfather, could you tell us maybe just an overview of what kind of man he was as far as his personality and stories that you've heard as far as that goes?
Well, it's like the stories told to me was that, and then through ceremonies, I learned things from him through ceremonies. So, he always was a compassionate, generous person. That he had the gift of understanding at a young age, as what his purpose in life was. And the people in his, it goes back to how the Americans always say chief. He's a chief. He's a leader. Well, they're not leaders. A chief is like a spokesperson, a caretaker, and a provider to the people. And he's not campaigning or anything to hold this place, because everything in life, in the Lakota way of life, is very difficult. Everybody has something they have to do when you're born into this world, and sometimes a lot of them would ignore it. They don't want to do it. They want to do something. They just want to be wild and crazy, and sometimes they don't last very long. They might just turn into out of teenage years, and then there's something happened to them. because they don't want to accept the fact of being chosen from the spirit world to do something. And my grandfather was chosen to be a Patron, as we call it, a chief, because of who he was. And 99% of the people who are chosen as chiefs are chosen by the women, because the women were the ones that had the wisdom and they had the knowledge. And a man who's being chosen to be the spokesperson and caretaker for the people has to have some of about maybe a percentage of a quality of the wisdom of a woman. Your elders, your grandmothers, your mothers, your older sisters, and your aunties. This was how it was back then. And we live in two different worlds now. His world's back here, and the world I live in is now, amongst the capitalistic world. Was two worlds. One's going forward. Lakota is always looking to the future. And the capitalistic world is the past. If you know what I mean, like you go to education and people get all these degrees. And the highest degrees you get, but you're studying the past. Everything's to the past, and what you do, what your ancestors did, or whoever wrote the book that you're studying, wrote it maybe 10, 15 years ago. And every decade or so, there's a new book comes out about the similar subject that you just studied, 30, 40 years ago. So, it's a constant cycle of the past. Where Lakota is the future. So with me, I have to stand like my grandfather. He didn't have that problem because there was no capitalistic world. It was just a world of the future, of taking care of the earth and all living things, the green growing things, the four-legged, the wing, and everything on this turtle island, as we call it, this North American continent, has a purpose. The ecosystem is balanced by everything, even the bugs, the snakes. They're all here for a reason and a purpose, just like we are. We come here for a purpose. And our number one goal is to be an Itchachan, is you have to be able to, it's a difficult, hard world because you have to take care of all these things. And also, the four-legged ones like the buffalo are the providers. Their flesh you consume his flesh to survive, but you use every part of that. But on the other hand, you also respect the spirit because that buffalo had a spirit. And you make offerings to the spirit, because if it wasn't for his existence, his flesh, bones, everything, your culture wouldn't be surviving. So you have to have that balance within the four-legged and you. And it goes all the way back. We have so much stories about why we have this. There used to be it starts with the creation stories, of our people, and then how we evolve into how we do as now as people. Back then it was natural. It was a hard life. People, try to romanticize it, by, so you see people dress up like natives or eagle or feathers and paint their faces. All these things were a sacred ways of a person, one individual, not the whole tribe, but one individual. And you earn these feathers for purposes, why you wear the feathers in your hair and how you carry yourself. And you learn this by example of the elders. You don't want to be like them, but you take a little piece of each elder and create who you are. And as you progress through life as a young person, all of a sudden you might go to the first ceremony and the spirit will say, okay, we choose you to do this. Okay, now that's up to you to accept it and walk with it. Or if you don't accept it, and the spirit will tell you at the beginning, he's going to say, if you don't accept it, we'll just take your spirit back to the spirit world. We can use you better there than on, in the flesh and blood thing. Our bodies are like a house or like a building. The spirit is inhabiting the body. It's not our mind, heart, and soul. The body is going to be born and go back to earth one day. But the spirit comes here, it lives forever. And when it enters this body, it learns. It's here to learn. And you have to be able to, if you're fortunate to have parents and grandparents who know what you should be, like a Lakota, to tell you, find out who you are, create within yourself the body. The mind has to, the spirit has to learn how to use the mind, heart, and the body, and all parts of this, how to function. And if you're chosen to be a chief one day, you're working your walk towards this, to one day to be a caretaker, a provider of the earth, and all the people that surround the camp. You know how to feed them when they need something. They're hungry. Nobody goes hungry. Nobody goes cold. And we had no jails. Nobody was accused. If you took a life of another Lakota, they banished you from the tribe. They strip you naked and they turn their backs and you say leave. They give you 4 years to atone for that. If you survive the elements, the bears, the mountain lions, the cold, whatever, the purpose in your life comes from you understanding your way of life. What you're here to do as a person. And that's how my great grandfather became. He really doesn't look at himself as a chief. He looked at himself as Sundancer. Sundance is a ceremony that came with a sacred pipe to our people. And this ceremony is called a Sundance because you are offering your blood, sweat, tears, and your energy and everything. You're showing in front of the Creator that you're doing this for the people and not for yourself. You're offering your sacrifices for the people to survive, for the ceremonies and for all living things to be able to survive, towards the future. And that's what he did all his life. He was a Sundancer. And it's difficult at times. You have to have that faith in the Creator in yourself to be able to do this. So these are the things that we as Lakota men and women, women, I wouldn't say they had it a lot easier because they have to go through the menstrual cycle every month. That's why they didn't have to go through these ceremonies that we do. When our ceremonies were brought to us, the ceremonies were for the men, except for one, that's for the women. And men weren't allowed to go there. So we don't know what they did in there, but that's how they enhanced and sharpened their wisdom to be the caretakers, the backbone of the tribe, actually.
So the what you were talking about with the Sundance, didn't your great grandfather, he had done a Sundance shortly before the Battle of Little Bighorn, right?
Right.
What does that involve physically?
Well, what he did was you do a vision first, what they call a humblecha. A humblecha is you cry through the night for direction and for advice from the Creator. And in English it's not a real accurate description. They call it a vision quest, but it's not really a vision quest. It's a crying through the night for direction and for acknowledgement, for something that's to the future within you. And so he did this humblecha in there's a little town called Cartersville, Montana, and it's just northwest of there. There was a ridge up. There was no houses or nothing. It was just open territory. And he did his humblecha out there. And through that humblecha, they showed him this. It's a rock wall, and a lightning bolt hit it. You could see where the lightning traveled down quarter way down this rock face. And he didn't know where this was, but the spirits told him this is where they want him to go perform Wiwongwachi, the Sundance. So he came down. He was doing a purification, which they call a sweat lodge. After the vision, you do this. And there was some Cheyenne elders that came in and joined the prayer. And one of them Cheyenne elders said, "We know where this rock is. That's a sacred place to our people." So they said, "We'll show you where it is." So they followed the Rosebud River down, After a while, they followed with the Cheyennes all the way to this place called the Deer Medicine Rouse. And there was this big rock formation. And on the south side was this where the lightning bolt hit this. You could see where the lightning traveled down maybe a third of the way and it stopped. So down below there is where he held his Sundance. He just did that himself. He had a couple of helpers and he offered 50 pieces of flesh from each arm, 100 pieces of flesh for what to do about the encroachment of the sacred Black Hills, which at that time they discovered gold here. And through the 1868 treaties, they said the whole Black Hills belonged to the Lakota people. But all of a sudden, gold discovered, so they all encroaching it. They broke their promise, of this. And he wanted to know what to do with it. I mean, what they should do. That's what he did, the flesh offerings at the Sundance. And on the second day, he started to have these visions of the future. And on the third day, he had a vision of soldiers falling into camp upside down with no ears. They're like grasshoppers, he said. And the voice came to him and he says, I give you these for they have no ears. And he didn't know, what they meant, but, you don't question the spirit when he gives you an answer. So it was not long after that, Crook was coming up the Rosebud River with his 2,000 troops. And the Lakota seen them, so they went and then the historians, they tell these big stories. They got 1,000 Lakota warriors. It was, I always tell people, the Lakota Cheyennes of the Northern Plains here, they were guerrilla fighters on the back of a horse. Now, if you know what a guerrilla fighter is, I was in Vietnam and I know what guerrilla fighters are.
Yes.
They'll be like 10, 20, maybe 30. And they hit you in strategic areas and make you think you're doing battle with 2,000 troops out there, when actually it's just groups that hit you at certain places and they disrupt your thinking, your march, or whatever you might say. And that's what they did to Crook. So he had to turn around. He went back to Laramie, Fort Laramie. So, but this was not the vision he had. He said this can't be it because they all left. They didn't die. So then the food was running out, and the horses, the grazing the grass. So they sent scouts in 4 directions to find out, where there's any game. And some scouts came back from the west and said towards what they call the Prejisla, which is where the grass is greasy looking. They call it, And they said there's a big herd of antelope there. So they said, we would go out there and then the grass is plentiful along the creek river there. So they moved the whole camp. And it wasn't like they say in history books, they always say, there's thousands of warriors. It wasn't true because these guys that came to my grandfather, he sent out word to come join him. So a lot of them, at that time, most of the natives were at these agencies like Pine Ridge Agency, Rosebud, Cheyenne River, and Standing Rock. They all have agencies where they have forts and little Indian agents who fed them cattle, to be around there and try to assimilate them into being Americanized. But a lot of them didn't want that, so they heard word, so they'd slip away with their families and they'd join Sitting Bull over, up on Montana along the Yellowstone River there. And they'd just show up. They had more horses than people. So they went further west and they found the herd of antelope. So they were feasting on antelope, and camped along the western edge of the Little Bighorn River there. And biggest, I guess the one that had the bigger tribe of people were the Huchbaba, Sitting Bull's people that were in the southern end. Campers to the south, they always scouted, so they were on the south. And then up along the river there, just spread out. They wouldn't just cut together, they would just spread out along the trees there. And, you had different nations there. You had Oglalas, Mikojus. You had, the Rosebud, the Sichanku. And then you had Cheyennes and Arapahoes show up. And, they didn't show up just in groups. They showed up as individuals. They had horses and they'd show up. And they might see somebody they knew and they'd say, come, camp next to us over here. So they'd camp, so it was just a social gathering kind of a thing. And what he was doing was when he got a certain day, he wanted to have a big meeting and with the people to see what they can do with this encroachment of the Black Hills. But they didn't know that Custer was coming up. He was slipping up on them, and he seen them there. And Custer had ignored the commands from higher command that he's supposed to wait for Terry and Gibbon to show up so they could, hit them from all sides. This camp if they found it. And turns out he was egotistical and he worked his men to death trying to get there around horseback. And they got up there in time on June 25th. They attacked. A 3-pronged attack he created, and it didn't work. And at that time, the men of fighting age, I guess you might say, ranging from late teenage years to late 50s, the men in these camps, the Cheyennes, the Lakota, numbered around 800. And that's about almost the same amount of troops as Custer's command. But he split them up. He had like 200 something guys. So they, Gibbon went one way. Reno went one way, and the captain went the other side, and Custer went the other way. They're going to try to attack the village from 3 different sides. But the first one was Reno, and he got chased back, because, he attacked and they overwhelmed him. And then goes to my great-grandfather, my granduncles. They were there, and they were just young boys. And they seen, they heard the shooting going on in the south. To the north, they had this big corral built up with ropes. And all the people left their horses up there so that, most of the horses, because most of these families had anywhere from 2 to 3 horses, maybe some of them 4. They carried their teepees and carried them and whatever. And, it might be a family with, that many horses. So they had them in this big corral up there, and they were like guarding them, the young men. And then they heard this little pop in this to the south. These granduncles were telling me this when I was like 5, 6 years old. We lived on a reservation, and they used to come to our house, and they talked about this. One of my granduncles was a deaf mute, and he didn't speak English. He didn't speak any language. So they would use hand signals, talk with hand gestures. And my mother knew how to do this, so she'd sit there and listen to him. And afterwards, when they never slept in the house. They slept out there in their teepee, in their tents she had set up. And they don't sleep on beds. They won't sit in chairs. They sat on the ground. These guys they lived another time. So at night, my mother would come in the house and tell us what they talked about, the stories they were telling. And she was telling us about the story about the Little Bighorn, what they experienced, what they seen. They said they were there, they were herding the horses, and all of a sudden, young men come running up, a little older than they were, getting their horses, that were in the crowd there to join the fight. They said there was some what they call them mila huska, long knives. They were attacking in the south into the Hunkpapa village. So they were getting the horses to join the fight. And a lot of them got their horses and they headed south, they headed towards that battle. And all of a sudden, he said, this place, if you ever been to the Little Bighorn battlefield, there's a place called the Deep Ravine. It's just south of the visitor center there, kind of like a little gully down there. It's a ravine. And west of that river there is where the horses were kept in the corral. And my granduncle said they looked over to the east and they seen the column of soldiers coming. There were 4 abreast. And they yelled, "There's soldiers are coming, they're right there. They're right there on the eastern edge of the Little Bighorn." And so they had no modern weapons, so they had bow and arrows and stuff. So they started shooting at them. And then all of a sudden, a Winchester started firing south of them a little bit. You could hear the Winchester rifle, and said one of these guys in the column was shot off his horse. And then another one got shot off his horse. And then the group behind him grabbed the second one, put him back on his horse. And then the rout happened, he said. They just turned and started trying to get to the top of the hill. Before they got there, a group of warriors came up around them, and the fight was started. They left that one laying there, I guess he was killed. And he said they didn't know what. And then the young men come running up, getting their horses and joined the fight. He said all you heard was this constant roar of guns and dust flying everywhere. And he said it didn't take long. It was just over. He said you hear shots going off now and then. And they didn't know who this column of soldiers were. So they crossed the river and they were laying dead. They were saying, they were telling about, how they were reacting, the soldiers. And one of my granduncles said, one of these soldiers got off his horse and shot the horse he was in the head, laid it down, used it for a barricade. And he had misty eyes. He said, it's that man. He said, when you do something like that, you're not going to see the sunset. He said, certain death for him. And he said, they fought bravely. He said, but they were all taken out. So they went through there, and all of a sudden they find Custer laying there. He had cut his hair short, and he didn't wear his signature buckskin coat that he wears. He was just like a regular soldier. He didn't even have that red scarf he always wore around his neck. He looked like a regular soldier. They didn't know he was Custer, and they didn't know who shot him, so they were how he was killed. But he had a bullet hole in his chest and one in his temple. And the Cheyenne women were just going after him because of what he did at the Washita in Oklahoma, to the Cheyenne people. And they're putting skewers in his ears and putting things up his penis, and all this because he raped a lot of Cheyenne women. And I was telling this story at the Little Bighorn when we were in the process of putting up that Indian memorial, and there was a Cheyenne elder there. And he said, we know that story too. He said, just like you're saying. He said, the only thing is, he says, it was a Cheyenne girl who had a Winchester rifle who shot them two. And we said, and seeing the Custer buffs don't want to hear that because they don't want to hear the fact that he was the last guy on the hill with two guns blazing. And he was the first one to get shot off his horse. And he wasn't killed because that's what, and then the other guy, the first guy that they shot was one of his scouts. His name is Bergier or something like that. He was half French and half Lakota. He was one of his scouts, Indian scouts, and he was killed. And in 2007, they found his skull down there in the deep ravine. They were walking around there and they found this partial skull laying down there, human skull. They did a test on it and knew it was a native. So that's who he was, because they didn't know whatever happened to that guy, And so this is our story of what happened there, this is what they said. And they talked in Lakota. So like I said, it stays in your brain. The way they told the stories, it's like they really felt sad telling the story because, the Lakota, the Native people didn't kill each other. They kind of cool on each other. You see our adversary tribe, like, Lakota and Assiniboine or something, or Flathead or something, you go up to him and you had the stick and you touched him and you let him live. What you did was you embarrassed him and degraded his position in front of his people. So he had to start from scratch again to, whatever feathers he owned, he had to redo that again. And it's the power of the soul, the spirits that are with you that help you many times to accomplish this. So the killing only came when the Americans came out here. So that's they really didn't appreciate killing. The shooting guns and shooting each other. Just touching each other was the coup. But so that was one of the things. But at the time before the battle, when Reno was attacking, my great grandfather went to his teepee to get his weapons to join the fight. And he's got to the door. This is what I was telling you at the beginning about women. They were the backbone of our culture. You did not go against them. You never looked your mother or your grandmother's in the eyes or in the face. If she's in the room, she's off to your right or behind you. You walk in the room and you sit in the chair, you look the other way. And I seen that with my uncle. He used to do that to his sister, his older sister. He'd go in and he would never look at her in the face. And I asked him why. He says, that's the respect I give to my older sister. He says, because if I look at her and she looks at me in the eyes, he says, you have a tendency to fabricate your story. So as long as you don't look at her, you what you're saying is true. And you're faithful to what you're speaking. But if you look at her in your eyes, he says, you have a tendency to not be honest. So, my grandfather was going to go into his teepee and his mother comes out and she stopped him and she said, it's time for you to take care of the elders and the young, take them to a safe place. And she says, let the young men prove their worth in how to protect the camp, the village. So he took her word. He didn't argue with her. He took the young people, the elders, and they went west to the ridge up there. And he kept an eye on them. So that's why he wasn't in the battle. I mean, this was the respect that he gave to his mother for her advice, So, again, these are things that my great-grandfather had a lot of respect for the women because of that, their wisdom. And that's what he tried to do, is he tried to garner a little more than 10% of wisdom of a woman, which is very difficult because you take a guy, I know you're a guy, I'm a guy. And sometimes you talk to, like my wife, she tells me something and sometimes it sounds so stupid. It sounds so dumb. You go, oh. But I always sit there and say, I listen to her, and it makes no sense to me at that moment. Then I think about it and I say, well, let me sleep on that, and I sleep on what next morning, get up next day, and what she said is accurate, right to the nail head. And I said, wow, I never would have thought of that as a man, That's what my mother always said. She said, that's why you men have to go into this, what they call the sweat lodge, the purification lodge, to sweat out all the negative energies in your body, she said. And she always told my sisters, and she says, don't ever go into one of them sweat lodges because it's full of women, the men's negative thoughts. So I guess in a matter of speaking, this is the way our culture is, but we have so much stories yet to share, and a lot of it goes against the American historians. They don't like to hear what we have to say because it's who we are, not who they think we are,
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That was one thing. My camera keeps messing with me, but we're getting good sound, so I'm excited about that. What is something that you mentioned some things about the Battle of Little Bighorn?
You okay?
Maybe something touch on something that is a misconception, like that is taught, in American history that's just not true. And you mentioned some things about the battle, which I think is very interesting, as far as Custer, he wasn't the last man standing, that sort of thing. Maybe what would be something else?
There's so many things, that the American historians botched it up. They completely dismantled, what happened at the battle. And, I read a lot of stuff, I read and seen in movies and stuff that what they said. And when I told the story at the Little Bighorn battlefield, the historians all came out and all the park rangers, and they said, well, that's not what we heard. I said, well, what did you hear? They said, well, this is what Godfrey seen. And I said, was he in the battle? I said, no, he was on the ridge over there with a pair of binoculars. I said, really? He said, yeah. I said, I heard that too. I said, but he wasn't up there no more than about 10, 15 seconds because a group of Lakota warriors are coming at him on horseback. So he took off, headed for Reno's camp. And I says, and so this group of soldiers from, they're ROTC students from the University of North Dakota. A few years ago, they asked me to come, tell them things what you're asking. So I joined them. There's probably about 10, 15 of these students, and we went up on this ridge, where this guy's supposed to have binoculars and seen what the battle was. And these guys had binoculars they use in Desert Storm, in Afghanistan and Iraq. It takes because of the heat waves just bouncing like this when you're looking through binoculars. And these things are supposed to cut down the heat waves a little bit. So we used them to look. It was towards the visitor center. And man, you could, there's a ridge right here. And you couldn't see where the battle was going on. So I said, how can he see anything? I said, he's only up there for 10, 15 seconds. And I said, so they said, that's not what we know. I said, well, how do you know? I said, there was only one survivor of the Custer's battle, right? Is that horse. I said, well, is he writing a book or did he tell a story or what? They want to hear from me. But I never get invited back to Little Bighorn because of the stories that was told to me, And I said, these are stories I'm not fabricating them. I said, I'm just telling you what they see. And then another park ranger came out and told me, he said, we can't, because other natives told stories about the battle, their ancestors seen. And they contradict my story, they said. So I says, I can tell you from example. I said, I've been to Vietnam, man. I said, I was in combat. And I says, and there's 30 guys, we're sitting in a jungle there. And so you get into a firefight. I says, you tell your story, what you've seen, what you experienced. And the guy on the other end tells his story. I said, they contradict each other because he's seen something entirely different from what you see. And I said, so how can you say, if we survived it, we tell the story in the same way, either one won and one lost. That's the number one thing. I said, one loss and one bad. But for this year is the 148th anniversary of that Little Bighorn, And there's still, I go up there and every time I turn around, they're still trying to justify Custer, why he lost. And I told them, I says, and the last time I was up there, a lot of times I go up there and ask me these questions, right? And I answer them. I says, it was a vision that was given to my great grandfather. I said, soldiers falling to camp with no ears, like grasshoppers, along with their horses. And I says, and they said, I give you these because they have no ears. And I says, Custer could have brought the 82nd Airborne Division in there, man, and the 7th Marines, and he still would have lost because it was written through a vision quest. And I says, unless you understand the spirituality of the Lakota people or the native people of this land, we live a spiritual way of life. We have a culture. It's unwritten rules, regulations, and policies, of the land. The land is our Bible, or you might say, or the land is our book. And the rivers and the wind, they tell us the stories. The animals tell us stories. The four-leggeds, the birds, they sing us tunes. A lot of the songs that we do in ceremonies, they come from these animals, a coyote, a wolf, a bird singing, or an eagle, or a hawk or something. He'll tell you something, in the song. And you can hear him, all you might hear is he's screaming, but actually there's a song if you're a spiritual person. And see, these are something we're right there. And that culture is steady. It never changes. It's still constant with us now. It was back there when my grandfather was alive. See, this is the misconceptions of the Americans. And they try to take that away from us, which they're successful in doing in many cultures. A lot of cultures in the country, they took it away from them. They don't know how to do their ceremonies no more because the Americans, I can't remember who it was that said, kill the Indian, save the man thing,
Yes, sir.
And a lot of them, they became Americanized, and they kind of forgot their culture. But the Lakota people, they took our ceremonies underground, our language, our songs, and how we do the ceremonies. I know my granduncles, one of them, he stayed with us. We lived on Pine Ridge. He'd go down to the creek and, he'd be gone for half a day, come back up. And he'd do it even summer, spring, winter, fall. And, when he'd leave, our mother always tell us, don't be looking for him or anything. He's just going down to the creek, or something, But one morning, it was winter, man, he left. And it was cold, man. I said, I got, my wife said, "You're nosy." I said, "No," I said, "I'm just an inquisitive guy. I just like to know things, So I walked around it was a big bank here. It was probably about, I don't know, 100 yards from our house, it was this bank. And I walked over to the edge, and down here was a little walkway down to the creek. And I peeked over the edge, and the little creek was all froze over, White Clay Creek. And he had chopped a hole in it, and he was sitting in it. And I said, "Oh, man," I come running back. My mother chewed me. I said, "Don't be," I said, "No," I said, "I was just walking around up there." I said, and she said, "Nah, you were trying to see." Well, I didn't know. Nobody told me why he was sitting down there in that creek. Well, later on, my older sister told me that he had this root. He had these certain roots. And she said he would build a purification lodge down by the creek. And he'd take his stones and put them inside the lodge. And he chewed this root and he'd blow on it, and the rocks just got hot. And he'd use that to do a purification. And she said that's probably why he went in the creek and cooled off, after he came out of the sweat, out of his purification lodge. And then they go to the Badlands and they would do their humblechas over there. They couldn't do the sun dancing because it was against the law. If they caught them doing this, they went to prison. Wow. You couldn't burn sage, sweetgrass, or smoke the pipe even. But they did. They would do it behind and they said, my granduncle said, "We're protected." He says, now, we used to see them, the federal agents sitting on top of the ridge over there on horseback with binoculars, looking at our house, looking at everybody's houses. Mm. And he says, they can't see us. And, I'm going, what do you mean you can't see us? He said, "You can't see you when you're smoking the pipe." He said, "Because we're protected." And, these are things that the historians or the movie makers or whatever don't understand. They don't realize, or organized religious leaders, they don't understand the spiritual way of life of the Native people. And that's how our ceremonies are still alive today because of that. That's why I did my ceremonies at. And I do my ceremonies. I have a prayer room here in my house, a ceremonial room. And I go in there and do my ceremonies, and I have my buffalo skulls in there and eagle feathers, my pipe, everything's in there. And I do my own ceremonies every morning, every night to do a healing with post-traumatic stress, that I suffered from for going to Vietnam. So this is my way of my own way of healing. I don't need drugs, and it's not a mental thing. It's a spiritual wounding. The post-traumatic stress is because of the traumatic events that occurred to us when we were in war. Or even not only in war, but, women being raped or car accidents or whatever. Even police officers can have post-traumatic stress, or firefighters, because of the traumatic events that they experience, in life. So these are the things that we as our people now, not many of us, but some of us, and then a lot of us are making the journey back to the spirit world, So my goal is to try to share with those that give me an ear, to especially natives, to go back and try to reconnect with your culture or your spiritual way of life, because if it wasn't for some of us who share this, our culture would be gone. I'll be lost.
Yes, sir. So what would you say to someone that is not a native, that is listening maybe? Why would it be important to read about your grandfather, learn about that kind of thing, even if they think it has nothing to do with them?
Well, like I say, at one time, before the incursion of the Europeans into our land here, they all had a culture once. They all had a similar culture with us, like ours. It's not the same like ours, but that I think they had it at one time. See, my wife is a full German. She's from Germany, and we went back to Germany in the February. First time we went, it was '95. She took me to introduce me to her family. I think she took me to see if they would accept me. As crazy as I am. But anyhow, excuse me. We went out there and we were just in the southern part of Germany. And her nephews lived down there, so we're visiting them. And he's taking us for a ride through, taking us to this lake they call Constance Lake. It's in southern Germany, next to France there. And we're going through this town, and they're having this big. And I asked my wife, I said, "What's going on?" It looked like the thing was in the middle of the street looked like a Sundance tree. And I said, "Wow!" I said, "What is this?" She says, "The Fasching." I said, "Fasching?" And she explained to me what Fasching was. And it is very parallel to Sundance. Our Sundance, it's a renewal of life, and it's a renewal of the earth, and the getting rid of the bad spirits and bringing the good spirits is what this Fasching is about. And it's basically almost very similar in explanation to our Sundance that we did. I mean, it's a tree that's put up in the middle of the street and had all these ribbons off of it. Our Sundance tree has all these tobacco offerings in cloth off of it. And, so that's when I realized, most of these cultures in Europe had the similar, concepts as we have over here, and like when we went I was in Finland. I was doing a talk up in Finland, and they have these, you go north, the further north you go up towards the Arctic Circle, they have the Sami people up there. And they have these rooms, their houses, they have like sweat lodges in there, and the Finns call them saunas, but they're not. The Sami guy told me, he said, they're just like your sweat lodge. He said, we go in there every morning, every night to purify ourselves. The guys did. The women, they have their own thing, he said, over there. And their culture is just like ours. I mean, the only difference between them and us is they're blue-eyed and white. They're Sami people, up in Finland, Norway, Sweden, and parts of Russia up there along the Arctic Circle. And they hold the reindeer in high regard as we hold the buffalo over here. Same thing. The reindeer, when they use its flesh for consumption, and every part of it they use for something in their life. So basically, I think one time or another, all these people had a sacred way of life one time. But when they came over here, they let that go, and they became Americanized, and they became part of a group of. It's like a big club, Americans. They named themselves after this America's de Vespucius or whatever his name is, and yeah, and so people ask me many times. It says, "What would you like? What do you prefer?" It says American Indian or Native American. I said, "No, I'm Lakota. That's who I am. I know who I am." I said, "I don't have my own language." I said, "I speak my language fluently. I know my ceremonies, and I know how I walk, a sacred way of walk. That's my walk. I don't want nobody to be like me. My children, my grandchildren, or people's other children or whatever." I said, "Take a little off of what I say and incorporate it in yourself to build who you are, but never have fear." Because that's the problem with the American people when they first came here. They came here with fear. They fear everything. Every time you see something, oh, they're afraid of it. They're fearing, and I mean, I used to watch this travel channel on TV with they have all these ghost hunters, right? And they're going there scaring each other. And I said, they don't need to go to some, like Deadwood down here to go to look for ghosts. Ghosts are everywhere here. Because the Americans, they killed each other. They just buried each other out here somewhere, and their spirits never go to the spirit world because they were educated through their religion not to to fear God or fear death. So they don't know if they died or not. They're still, their souls are still haunting the earth. They don't go back to the spirit world. And like I was telling people, I mean, I've angered a few of these organized religious leaders in my walk here, because I told them, I said, in your good book, you speak of a heaven and a hell. I says, well, we have a spirit world, and we have the hell is who you are, what you create for yourself. There's no savior in our culture. The savior is you. How you do amongst all living things on this earth is how your spirit will go back to the spirit world. There's no heaven or hell. The hell is you living in fear. Fear is what causes you to be not make it back to the spirit world, and fear is what causes you to look for a leader. Where in the Lakota, we don't need leaders. We take care of our own. We just have a chief or a Patron in charge who cares for all people. So you just like to be around him. That was the main thing. Have so many lodges around the chief because he's a caretaker, provider, and a spokesperson. He can speak words to nations, without anger or without any kind of a dispute. So actually, we all have this. Every one of us should be having that gift to do the same thing for our own families, in a circle.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Mr. LaPointe. I have thoroughly enjoyed this. And where's the best place that people could buy your book? Because I just think everybody needs to read this.
Yeah, well, there's the only places I know right now that around here is Prairie Edge. They could mail it out, the same book, or if they have it, the Little Bighorn, places like that, And I also did a documentary called Sitting Bull's Voice. I don't know if you ever seen that one.
I think I saw bits of it on YouTube. Maybe, I'm not sure. I saw a couple interviews with you.
Yeah, well, the guy who did the documentary with me, we won quite a few awards, best documentary awards, and on his website, he has a website called realcontact.com, REEL contact.com, and he has a I don't know what they call it, Vimeo thing or something. You can purchase the thing for, I don't know, $3 or something, $3.99 or something, and watch the thing. I have one myself, but it's mine. It looks like that.
Okay.
It's called Sitting Bull's Voice, and it basically talks about the comparison between my grandfather's time and me, and then it has the repatriation of the hair, the leggings that were taken off of him when he was murdered, and how we had to go through the family tree thing and all that. And then they were held at the Smithsonian in Washington. So we went up to Washington a couple of times. They invited us to come out there. I went up there and they showed me the 1866 Winchester rifle that he had when he came back from Canada and surrendered at Port Beaufort in 1881. They have it there, and I got to hold it in my hands.
Oh, wow.
I don't know if it's in pictures in that book or not. I think it's in the book.
I know I saw a picture of you somewhere. I don't remember. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, that's the book there.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the rifle that he surrendered.
Mm.
And then we got the hair back, and then the leggings, and an ancient DNA specialist from Denmark came here, and he wanted to know if he could do a DNA thing on the hair. And I told him, I says, I can't give you that permission. And he said, why? I said, because it's not my hair. And he goes, well, who do I ask? I said, you have to ask my grandfather. He looks at, he's a scientist. He can prove anything scientifically. He goes, well, how do I do that? I said, well, come to the house December 15th, 2007. We did a ceremony here in the house, in the basement here. And I said, so he came, and the medicine man invited my great-grandfather's spirit to come in here. And, for the leggings that we had, the hair and other things that people had to give to me, said it belonged to him. some of the things said didn't belong to him, because a lot of people, the Smithsonian had over 1,000 items in there that said it was belonged to my grandfather. None of it did. Only a pair of beaded moccasins, that rifle, the hair, and the leggings. That was the only ones that came off of him. Mm-hmm. So he asked him, and the spirit told him, give him about 3 inches of the hair. The rest, he told me I had to burn it, throw it, take it, and, dispose of it to the air. So he took this hair, and it took him, they had to have more, they kept creating more dedicated, more sophisticated equipment to really, because they had very little DNA in there, in the hairs, because there was no root on it. They just cut it off. So what DNA they got out of it, they had to save it until they get a better equipment to really analyze the fingers or whatever that come off the DNA. Eventually they did, and 2 years ago they finalized it. It was a big story in the Science magazine. They said this is the first time that the scientists ever created a DNA genetic connection from a great grandfather to a great grandson. And that's when he told me. He said, I got the thing. I don't know all the formula things, but what he said in there was every individual has a genome, a certain genome in us as males and females. And he said, but the male, he passes his genome on to men, and the boys and girls of his children, grandchildren, and that thing stays constant all the way, he says, to your great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren. Every time a son, your grandson would have a children, they would always come up with that. So that's how they proved me as a lineal direct descendant of Sitting Bull.
You've been listening to The Cultured Bumpkin, a literature podcast with Jake Phillips. Thank you very much for listening. I really do appreciate it. If you enjoyed this, would you mind going and subscribing and leaving a nice review on whatever podcast platform you heard this on? I would really appreciate it. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.